Today we're talking about, we were supposed to be doing this presentation, we're supposed to be the lecture today on interpretation machines, but I've moved that lecture because I want to go to Joburg and visit some memorial projects up there before I give that lecture, because I think it's a particular, memorialisation is a particular topic in South Africa that I want to look at. So I've just shuffled things around a little bit. This lecture is, in talking about contemporary landscape architecture, there are a range of sort of historical things to come from, and I've talked about Barcelona, and that's a major one. But I think in a way, if you're talking about contemporary landscape internationally, and I mean, then you talk about Barcelona, you talk about the Netherlands, and you talk about landscape urbanism as the thing that have shaped contemporary landscape architecture. Now, obviously, before, when I first wrote this lecture, I was in Australia, and the Dutch did not have the same resonance and perhaps negative connotations that they would have here because of the history of South Africa. So please, I'm not being disrespectful to those histories. I'm just recognising that there is a kind of cultural practice of land making in the Netherlands that is really important to how we understand landscape architecture now. Because essentially, landscape architecture is a practice of working with natural systems. And as I will argue in the book that I was just talking about, that I'm putting out, called Overgrown, and as I argued in my PhD, that is probably its major difference from landscape architecture, which is that its materials are systems and they change over time. And that means that while we in landscape architecture use the form languages and the design grammars and all of those other contexts about producing design that come from architecture, which are about the agency of design, the material tools, the material themselves and the processes give design a very, very different thing in landscape architecture. And if that's probably the one thing we'd want to come out of in this subject. And so with that in mind, as I say at the top here, there's this saying that the Dutch have, which is God made the earth, but the Dutch made the Netherlands. And that expression is a sort of arrogant expression, but there's an element of truth to it. And it's also an interesting thing to think about in terms of colonisation and the history of the country, because it very much comes from, the Netherlands is a place that is essentially a kind of people in a place that did not really exist. And so what you're looking at in the Netherlands is people who were dispossessed from other places, creating land in a wetland, which was not stable land at all, and then creating an empire through the fact that they were a water-based people. And so if we look at the Netherlands over time, what you kind of discover is that the whole landscape itself is essentially a wetland, and obviously it's at the junction of a couple of let me zoom in here. A couple of rivers, really, and obviously there's the Rhine is probably the main river that has structured the Netherlands. And so I did a trip a few years ago in Australia with students where we looked at the Rhine from where it sort of starts up in Switzerland, visiting cities along the Rhine and looking at how the Rhine has activated and worked with the different cultures. And so very much the Netherlands is a river delta, essentially. And because of that, its entire way of operating is around the reclaiming of land from water. Earlier, you've got to recognise that there were there were people living in this area which were kind of the Merovingians. And so there were earlier sort of Celtic derivative sort of people there, and the Merovingians were living in quite different ways to the ways that the Netherlands operates now. And there's a big issue in the Netherlands around what's known as the Randstad, which is the sort of like the round city, the idea that the city is surrounded by green, and also that it's in this water landscape. And there's been two major approaches to do with the major floods that hit the landscape. And so obviously that one of the most major floods was in the 1970s, and that flood really changed the way that Dutch land practices operated because of the catastrophic damage that happened in that period. And so the previous approach is best summed up, I think, around these two images here, which is to say that if you look at them, particularly this one here, you'll see they call this a refuge mound, and this is a terp. You'll see that this landscape is graded like this, and a lot of that grading is to do with the fact that there was a kind of flexibility in water movement built into the system. And so, for example, the turpin, which is like this here, was obviously losing my mouse here, that there was a mound upon which the housing was built, but also a place, for example, where cattle could come when there were floods. So floods were accepted as a normal part of living in this landscape. And so essentially this is these are both flexible models because they allow for water rising and they allow for water dropping. And so on balance, there's a sort of there's a sort of net elevation that they want to get to allow cattle and people to survive those flooding periods. But over the history of the Netherlands, they worked on a range of different methods to allow for water to be relocated to reclaim ground. And those methods really are of two main sort of sorts. And if you look at a map here, you can see the scale of their endeavours. And, you can also see that from what they undertook in the Netherlands, they also exported their drainage mechanisms to places like the Veneto and and France particularly to use those same technologies to reclaim land. And so they didn't just create land for themselves, they developed an industry about land reclamation. And that role and that importance of water means that they still have, for example, like a royal commissioner of water who up until recently was a guy called Dirk Simons, a landscape architect. And so the role of landscape architects in Netherlands, which is elevated at a high level, is actually largely due to the fact that water management means that landscape is really vital to how the place functions or doesn't function. Now, the term that the Dutch utilise is called polders or poldering, and the polder process is a process by which water is extracted or moved from an area, and the landscape is called the resultant landscape is called a polder. And you can see that there's two types that there's three types here. What they call diked polders, drained polders, and these Zuiderzee polders. And so they very much describe two different sort of methods that you can see in this sort of these images here to some extent. And so a drained polder involved really trying to utilize existing features to fill in. So you might fill in an existing and drain an existing lake, for example, or temporary feature like that, or you might change the way that a river operated, and so you're reclaiming land from existing water. Whereas another option was, and so that's very much a kind of, and these sort of examples you can see here are where and you can pick them quite comfortably because they're these sort of naturalistic lines within an otherwise landscape that is entirely sort of cultured, I suppose. You can pick these remnant features where existing watercourses and lakes, etc., have been reduced in extent, filled in, drained, etc., compared to these polders where they are entirely synthetic inside a larger drained structure. And so the techniques that were utilised to do that were really about smaller and smaller processes of demarcating smaller and smaller units for drainage, basically. And so the historic techniques for making polders, or making dikes, I should say, were, for instance, like this one here. These were the sort of medieval techniques that were utilised. And so you can see that when we talk about the medieval, we are talking about migration from other places, from Flanders, etc., and moves towards the Netherlands. And you can see here where you've got a mounding of soil, then the use of sort of stakes along it, seaweed, another lot, then soil up against that and stones against that, or the creation of sort of like peat bricks and the piling of peat bricks to create retaining walls. And so on the other side, you can see that those areas are at a lower height. And the reason that they were at a lower height is that they utilised a range of technologies to remove water from behind the dike. And so here, for example, these were talked about as more modern sort of methods that you can see there. And I'll talk a little bit about this spot here in the IJsselmeer and this particular dike that's become very major in terms of how it's worked with the land. And so the major techniques, I've got to remember that the major techniques, as I mentioned, were to really involve the use of windmills, but before that they involved the use of trees. And so if you can imagine, what you might be doing in this situation is you're isolating off the body of water. You're then, in a way, letting that, once you've isolated that body of water, you've got forces like evaporation, you've got other forces so that there's not as much tidal movement in and out. And so that isolated body of water starts to reduce its extent. And then what they utilised a lot of was the planting of trees. And trees are essentially pumps, because what happens with trees is, through the process of photosynthesis, there is what's known as transpiration, which is the process of water leaving the plant through its stomata, which are under its leaves, and just through photosynthesis, plants have no choice but to be pumps. And that's why, effectively, on the one hand, plants have adaptations to reduce transpiration, because they can't control it themselves. Otherwise, what they're doing is they're always, whenever they're photosynthesizing, they're always sucking water. And so, essentially, if you plant more and more trees in that situation, you're drying out the land, which, of course, is what everyone blames these dastardly eucalyptus trees as doing. My compatriots from Australia, these wonderful productive plants that offer so much to South Africa. And so, like briarwood, shade, fine timbers. But nonetheless, later on, of course, windmills became one of the main tools to this. So you can see that there's a kind of mental, and over time there are this sort of range of ways, and this diagram is one that I have quite a hard time really understanding, but I'll put it up there anyway. And so, yeah, you can see how you're creating one sort of dike, and then what you're doing is you're effectively lifting an area. So what you're doing is, if you can imagine, we're flat here, we dig a channel, the material from the channel gets put on top of this spot, which gives us something like the historic Turpin, and then we utilise trees, etc., to keep the levels lower. And this still has to, and this is where you get to this crazy point, this still has to go somewhere, because you're talking about places that are up to 5 metres underwater. So it's not like it's just neatly going to come out the end. And so there is where pumping is inherently a part of this process. And so the windmill starts to change radically how that process occurs. And so we also have the creation of these type of situations now, which are really crazy, where essentially you're creating a diked levee which is higher than the adjacent landscape, and you're living below that to be able to move all of that water out. So it's a catastrophe whichever way you look at it. And so, as I say, this process has caused this kind of, and this is an attempt to try to show to show the kind of relative, a diagram to show the relative depths of different places in relationship to the poldering techniques in the main body of water. And so there is the main harbour into Amsterdam, and you can see how these landscapes start to stretch, to drop down, and to then drop down further. So there we've got one drop down to one level. Then we've got another drop down to another level. These are pumping stations, effectively. Another drop down to another level, you know. And so it's really quite an extraordinary process, which is also, as we say, each one also has to have its own, because rainfall still occurs. And so you still have to actually find a place to capture and move water from, even in those lower levels. And you have to maintain a pumping framework. That means that as it's moving from one to the next, up, and out into the sea, the rain never gets too much such that the whole polder fills up. So crazy stuff. And then, you know, this is a kind of process where they talk about, I can't really see here, but, you know, so the peat polder is where you're digging. I've not really understood this sort of diagrams, but nonetheless, if we go up a bit higher, we can start to see how some of these peat polders work. So let's just show an example. And so as you can see here, one of the points that one's doing is that essentially you dig a trough, you lift, you dig a trough, you lift, you dig a trough, and you create strips of agricultural land. Then you begin to isolate, and then you begin to flatten out through this process. But essentially you're digging like troughs through mud. Now, one of the things that is also quite amazing about the Netherlands is that because of this sort of configuration, there is something that's called polder blindness, which is that when you're in this sort of landscape here, and it's something that's in law, when you're in this sort of landscape here, and the landscape is so uniform, and one's in a car going 120, and by the way, you can't go anywhere for longer than about half an hour before you reach the end of the Netherlands at 120. But nonetheless, people have this problem of smashing into other cars at 120 kilometres an hour because the landscape has so few features and is so uniform that people lose their depth perception in the place. And so effectively how far things are from each other is lost. And so that accident, when two cars smash into each other at about high speed, is called polder blindness in Dutch traffic law. And so, you know, there's a lot of discussion around the role that this landscape has played around Dutch identity and art. And so there's a lot of discussion around the idea that this sort of, that the art from De Stael and this sort of abstract De Stael geometries arise from this physical condition in the landscape, and in a way the landscape itself is treated as a kind of a cultural work of art as much as it's treated as any sort of natural thing. And so that means that the Dutch characteristically tend to have an idea that they're not so interested in nature as a preservation condition. They're interested in nature as a system. And in a way, nature is something that is essentially denatured. And so from a colonial point of view, a lot of the time I think, particularly colonials in terms of being people who come from other places to places, there's a general thing, if you looked at sort of, you know, colonial culture in the US, in Australia, and in South Africa, you'll see this kind of celebration or fascination with the indigenous landscape, less with indigenous people, but a fascination with the indigenous landscape and a desire to sort of try to have something that's pre-colonial maintained. And I think that's, for me, I always found an interesting trope that when you go to somewhere like the Netherlands, that idea about landscape as an existing entity that should be preserved is not something that the Dutch would find interesting. They find interesting the fact that they utilised these landscape processes to make land, etc. And so, with that in mind, I think that we get to a particular type of landscape that really works to manipulate landscape systems. So let's talk about this polder system in the 20th century more and more. And so one of the biggest sort of processes. And what I'm doing in this image is I want to walk you through a sort of like 80-year history of a polder, so that we have some idea about how long that process takes and the various stages that operate, and also the ways that landscape planning operates in that sphere, because landscape planning is something which is very well established in the Netherlands, and it forms a major part of the Dutch planning system. And so in a way, because the landscape is manufactured, and because, as we might see here, that makes it a cultural work, landscape architecture is integral to it, because the landscape it would always be treated as an aesthetic product at the same time as it's a functional product, because there's not this conservation stream or this ecology stream that says ecology is separate from art. There's no separation between culture and nature. They're the same thing. And so therefore landscape planning and landscape architecture is kind of integral to that practice in that place. And so we look at a range of different sort of maps, and a lot of this stuff is from this book, which I put a reading up, I think, called In Praise of Common Sense. And that is an amazing book that talks about this one particular polder, which is the IJsselmeer polder, which is this one here. And so if we sort of look at it, it's quite an interesting process. And obviously this is a kind of early image of it, but if we zoom into over here, you can see the different stages that it takes. And so if you look, you can see here is Amsterdam, and we can start to plot our way through. Here is, if we kind of try to find the earliest polders that we can find, looks to me like this one here at 1550 is looking like the oldest one. Is there another one there, that 1599? And so 1550, you can see these are all of these lake polders, where effectively here's a small lake, we've isolated it, emptied it, turned it into land. And so you can see they become a way of infilling this main kind of area here of the city. And then it starts to, and so there's all of them were pretty much that sort of form, really, infill, infill, infill. Until you get to this one here, which is really, these ones here are actually ones where, for instance, here we build a dike along this edge and we fill in. But first off, you'll see there is a separation over here in 1932. And so what that separation is doing is that's isolating IJsselmeer from the sea above it. And so it allows it to sort of stabilise, that stabilises this water body first. So it's not under the influence of the larger sea. It's sort of protecting this body. And then after that, you can start to see a number of other spaces, other dikes that start to come in. We have this wall here. We have 1945 here, 1942 building in here, 56. So Flevoland and South Flevoland, obviously that's essentially an island inside this lake, this larger lake, which is separated from the sea. And so obviously there's a point at which, once all of this is filled in, they're no longer islands. What you have is you have these canals running through a landscape. And so the relationship between what's land, what's sea, what's island, what's canal starts to change. And so all of those, this is a sort of another sort of vision of how that works. And this is that dike that we were talking about before. And so that's the sea wall along here. And it's quite extraordinary because when you drive along it, what you see is that you can't see land in either direction along it. And so in itself, that's quite an odd experience, to be in the middle of a kind of road, in the middle of a sea. And, obviously you think to yourself, if the weather changes, I really don't want to be out here. But it's quite an extraordinary sort of thing. If you look at it closely, you also see, I don't know why it's zooming when it's supposed to be. You'll also see here is a bike track along here. There's railway lines as well on the inside. And, there's sort of lookout platforms. different sort of hierarchies in terms of the way that things are organised. And this is part of this sort of rationalism of Dutch planning, which is very much around how different functions can be put together. So it's a very functionalist. And so if we plot and look and talk about this place called Almere, I think it's interesting to have a look at different stages of that process. And so, you know, when Almere started, obviously every period has its own design sort of ethoses. And so when you're building a piece of land over 100 years, think about how many different sort of ethoses of design there have been over 100 years. And so when this sort of process first starts, you're really potentially in the Beaux-Arts, a period where we're sort of neoclassical, and by the end of it, you're in a period, well, no, that's not entirely true. The 30s is modernism in the Netherlands, but its own particular sort of modernism. And by the end of it, you're in postmodernism. You've gone through all these different periods because it's a long process. And this is also a thing to think about infrastructure generally. Infrastructure, as we'll talk about this more, but infrastructure generally takes long amounts of time. For example, I've worked on a lot of road infrastructure projects. Most of those projects, I undertook the planning studies and initial studies of them in the 90s. And those projects are now only being built now. And so that's 20 years later, because all of the different periods of planning and funding and going for applications and dealing with exceptions and changes of technology, changes of government, gets put on the back burner, comes back again. And if it looks anything like what you thought it was going to look like 20 years ago, you're quite lucky. And I'm lucky that the same practice aspect worked on that project now, and so it's pursuing what we pursued at the time. And so I think it's interesting when you look at that sort of process. And so here is the kind of branding of Almere as a place in that, and it's a kind of like, it's a sort of 70s, you know, it's kind of quick, clear sort of, I mean, I don't speak any Dutch. Anyone wants to translate that for me from Afrikaans to Dutch or something like?
In the news, the big part, in the new city, in the new land, in the stad, one new city in one new land.
What would it look like?
What would it look like?
What will Almere look like?
And so, you know, this is probably so you can see how this idea of the Dutch making the Netherlands, and the idea that everything's new and everything's up for grabs is really important. You know, you can also see that when one starts to plan that sort of process, you know, the levels of consideration that have to go in to be able to develop and work with the water maintenance inside that polder are incredibly complex. I mean, I don't know if you can see these kind of keys. So, you know, here's where the horizontal flow, we've got seepage, pumps, the areas of inundation, sluices, dams, natural cleaning. So we're not just talking about wetlands as in let's remove some fecal coliforms and bits and pieces. We're talking about overall ways to control flood events and to work with it. And so in terms of those periods, one of the kind of periods that I find most interesting, which is from this period at the top here, is, I just can't see my, yeah, okay, is sort of, you know, here this model of urban design or city planning is following a kind of like a sort of like a combination between a kind of zoning and a metabolic model. And so if we locate this in the 60s and 70s, we're starting to see models where in architecture things like megastructure are occurring, the idea of continuous buildings that occupy things, the idea that things in nature and systems in culture and science resemble each other. So we're talking about kind of DNA, we're talking about chemical diagrams, and so we're very much talking about models that treat the city as a metabolic process where one zone and another zone relate to each other in a particular way. You know, once we start to work that thing up, you know, we can start to see how that progress works. We can also see something really fundamental about how this works, which is that in a way open space is the opportunity open space results from water management. And so if you want to talk about the fact that the Netherlands is, in terms of population, it's got this weird thing that it's incredibly dense. but it also seems really open. And that's because their housing densities are really high, and they very consciously leave space open at the same time. So it's quite a weird conundrum to think about it being denser than South Africa, but in actual fact, South African cities would look much denser. And we can also see how here all of this open space system is tied to water management, because of the fact that obviously there's a few things here. One is that the prevailing thought in the world in this period in suburban housing and other housing was that the open space forms the organising system for development. And so, for instance, if you looked at suburban development in any of the colonies, and South Africa is included in this, if you look at the planning of, say, Durbanville's subdivisions during the 60s and 70s, all of them follow a similar process where water systems become open space systems and housing feeds into them. And obviously, just anecdotally, you can tell that easy relationship that would have, everyone, during apartheid, like everyone, there was this idea you could jump over your fence and get in the landscape. And obviously, sort of South Africa's sort of paranoid security culture means that those open spaces don't function like that anymore. But here we can see that model, and so they're converged with each other. We can also see that, obviously everything moves into the centre of the city, and so the centre of the city has a kind of structure that also has this sort of some aspects of, the metabolic to it. But by the time it actually gets built, it's quite interesting, because in the period that the city really starts to get developed, we've gone from high modernism metabolic models for how the landscape and the city should operate. We've moved into a period where urban design has happened, and so instead the models have now become models that try to replicate European cities and models that are related to things like, so we've got, they're vaguely historicist. And so here we have perimeter blocks, and we have all of this sort of urban design that is very much developed around a kind of the sort of postmodern period of urban design. But by the time the projects actually get built, by the time that Almere got built, the projects had changed again. And so here is is it Maximilian Fuchsas? Who's the name of the architect here? I just lost it for a second. Someone look up Almere for me and the centre and find out who it is. I know Koolhaas has got projects. But you can see by this stage it's changed completely. So whereas previously in the planning models that were happening, after the poldering models, etc., after the early stuff, by now the perimeter blocks have turned into this thing where the place has one overall landscape which is above, where you can move around, and it's a green landscape above, and then it's an urban landscape below. And so it's a totally different sort of... it's Koolhaas, but there's somebody else.
It just says designed by Koolhaas.
Yeah, one part of it is, but I can't remember who did the rest of it. But you can see how this is now this line. You can see there's this brown, and I would hazard a guess that that's trying to inform you to the fact that that's the real water level, and this is the natural ground level, and this is what they're playing with. I don't know that, but I'm sort of saying that. And so, if you can imagine that when the person who started, or the people who started this process through here started it, I'm pretty sure that they had no idea that this process at the end was going to be what it looked like. And I find that an interesting idea, because it accepts the fact, and this is something that I think that that the Netherlands is good at doing, is it accepts that each period makes a contribution to the design culture of the time it is. So, the old isn't celebrated any more than the contemporary, because the contemporary will become old eventually. And so it's a kind of, the landscape is a kind of pastiche. It's all artificial. There's nothing historical. During the same time, you can also start to see how once, this relationship to the, water body also allowed for a lot of landscape architecture to occur. And one of the periods of Dutch landscape architecture that is really present is, this is a kind of classic 90s Dutch project where you can see it's a kind of compositional, very compositional approach insofar as you can see it's very plan driven. And the reason I say that, I know that we've had discussions in studio around this idea of something being plan driven. What I'm referring to is that on the ground, the rectangularity of that would not be something that would be of any interest, because you would never make its rectangularity out. And so it's been driven by a composition above that's totally unrelated to what's on the ground, but that was a trope of the time. And also planning, you can see that the planning is operating in the same kind of way. The same is true here of this kind of, the way that the lake edge has been utilised in this example here. Yeah.
It's Christian de Rosamat, French.
Yes. Yes. That's Potomac, right? Yeah, that's right. And so that was he who did that, and then various people worked within that, such as Koolhaas. Yeah, so that's just, and I think if you think of this, that then shows you that there is a kind of continuum from this approach that continues right into the present. What I want to talk to you quickly about, though, is also about how the landscape operates within these type of housing structures, because one of the things the Dutch are really good at is designing these kind of contexts. And so I'm going to introduce you to a few landscape architects who worked on this period, and probably one of the most important is this guy Nico de Jonge. And if you think about the idea that all of these dikes and all of these polders became a infrastructure at the same time as they undertook water activities, like where do you put a road? If you want to make a road, you need to make sure it's not threatened by water. What do you do with it? You elevate it. If you're elevating it anyway, what do? You might put your power along it. And so you can begin to see that the dike stops being just a dike and becomes something else. And so with very small amounts of, with very small tweaks, de Jonge was able to, develop a whole sort of interesting typology of approaches to deal with these kind of dikes in different situations, where each one of them functions and operates in different sorts of ways. And so, and each of them, I think you can see, I know there's not a lot of res here, but you can see how there's, for example, here is the road in the dike. So there is the dike form. Here is the road. Here is some screening. Here is a footpath next to the dike. On the other hand, here we have a situation where the visibility is such that we want to see into the polder, and so there's an elevation of trees of different heights, and so each of them is a different sort of way of organising the section along the dike to deal with all of the different infrastructural things that they are working on. Some of the sort of, there's a sort of, part of it also was that in the manipulative process were also resources around trees, where, for instance, trees were not just for parks, trees were keeping water tables down. And so you're also working with the park as something that is undertaking a hydrological function, it's undertaking a social function, it's undertaking a productive function in terms of timber, it's also undertaking a kind of biodiversity function. Because if you can imagine that biodiversity is really important in a place that's being manufactured, because there is so little there to start with. And so there's been overall, it's a lot of this process is in a way developing what I would refer to as novel ecologies. Ecologies that are arising from cultural circumstance where animals and plants are coming into contact with each other that may not have been evolutionarily related to each other, but through cultural practices are now living in an ecological relation to each other. This is important because of the fact that, if you remember last week, I talked to you about Seth Denizon's dissertation and his approximations of the Anthropocene in relationship to soil categorization. This is a similar sort of thing. We're now talking about, there's a great book that's called Rambunctious Gardens by Emma Maris, and she talks about designer ecologies, novel ecologies, and so once you take out nature as a loaded cultural thing, what you're really talking about is plants plants relating to each other in an ecological and animals relating to each other in an ecological way. So you might not be worrying about whether or not this plant came from Ethiopia and ended up in Netherlands, because it's really about what ecological niche it fits. Yeah.
Aren't they doing the best in biodiversity in the world?
The Dutch.
Yeah, their EPI index rating is #1.
Okay.
They're the most biodiverse.
Which is interesting considering it's totally manufactured. But don't forget that biodiverse has nothing to do with where the plants are from. Biodiverse is the diversity in a location, unless I'm wrong. Let's find that out. That's good. Because in a way, if you think about it, when you talk about biodiverse, the literal sense of it, it would be the sheer different numbers of species within one location, right? I would imagine. So in a way, the process of doing the landscape of it, even though it was seemingly a kind of based around a recreational paradigm, was doing a lot of things as well, and creating small parks in the intersections, and there's a lot to do. Another great landscape planner who came after. Nico de Jonge was a guy called Alla Hosper, and Alla Hosper, probably one of the projects that I know best of his was this one. That's this storage facility, this gas storage facility, and you can also see here where some of the techniques and the ways that landscape is dealt with for the process of forestry and poldering is starting to be dealt with in such a way that it also works with screening land uses and working with other land uses. Now, this guy here, or this firm called HNS, and Dirk Simons is one of the most famous, undertook a massive program of dike building in the Netherlands. And you can see lectures of Dirk Simons on YouTube, and it's probably worth watching them. And so if you consider that this is a massive dike, a kind of protective dike that was built across the Netherlands, because obviously climate change, is something that the Dutch are extremely worried about. And the first people to hit the ground after Katrina in New Orleans were the Dutch, and they were there to observe the emergency services process, to learn from how the emergency services did or did not cope with the event, which of course they didn't do very well. And they've also done a lot since then around working in New Orleans, and it's sort of selfish because they're also testing stuff for themselves. And so when you've got a piece of sort of mega structure topography running through the landscape like this, it becomes a whole range of multiple things. It intersects with a whole lot of different structures, and you can see how at some points, it pushes its way into forests, at other points into wetlands, sometimes it becomes recreational, etc. One element transformed. Another park of theirs, and I think that this idea about what's land, what's water is interesting also, and here's an earlier sort of modernist design, which I've always liked, And so this one is interesting because in a way, you've got an immediate contrast, which is you've got so much water to use that land is novel. And so in a sense, if we think about what grass happens here, grass, well, not so much now, but grass traditionally has been in the sort of Western landscape, grass is the default surface because it's easy to maintain. Hop on a mower, mow it, with water issues, it's no longer sustainable. But in a way, you have water operating as grass in this situation as the background. And here, these small forests are sort of sitting on top as little pockets of different types of garden experience set amongst this water landscape. What's land, what's water, etc. And this is another project of the same type by Dirk Simons and HNS. And here you can start to see the intersection between, for example, George Hargrave's approaches to dune landscape and the dike hybridizing, etc. in the 90s, a similar sort of thing happening internationally. But what I'm going to do now is walk through a place where I stayed for a few months when I was working in the Netherlands on a project called the Eco Cathedral, in a place called Heerenveen. I suppose if people are into soccer, they'll know about this particular town because it's got one of the biggest soccer stadiums in the Netherlands. As far as I was able to see, that, apart from the coffee shops, was the most interesting thing about the place. And so You can see in this drawing here how there are these kind of spines of water running through everything. And if you look at this diagram, I think you can see how there is a kind of that sort of parallel process of the polder and the compartments that one sees in the polder landscape continues to play out. And these pads that run through here are the canals that are in a sense draining these elevated pieces of land in between. So there's this series of lanes, each of which is a water-based and landscape-based thing. And so you go from a centre, which is traffic, then you go into the housing in this zone through here, which backs onto water and green space. So it's got a functional side, which is the kind of traffic side, and then it's got the back side, which is backyards onto landscape. And so that's also, as I said, a suburban model that we've seen, but it's in a much sort of deeper scale. But it's interesting, it's easy to say that, but when you drive or you go through it, it's quite interesting. So I was staying in this place here, which was one of these, which is in one of these places, and you can see how, as I was saying, inside here and here, you have parking courts onto the road, etc. And this is a bike track and a pedestrian track that runs through. Here we have a body of water that's being drained, and that body of water moves inside here. What's really interesting was that, and there is the road going through. Even though I probably wasn't supposed to be riding on that, but anyway. And so you can see moving along through there how that working with that sort of green edge in relationship to the water body. But when you get into when you move into it further, what I think is quite interesting is that you end up in these kind of forest spaces. Now, as a space, these are the same as the sort of spaces that Nico de Jonge is drawing, for instance, in where are we? Like in this kind of space here, or even more tightly compressed, so that when you're inside them, you completely lose track of the fact that you are in a sort of an urban area. Now, obviously, this presupposes, like in South Africa, that would be the last place you would walk down, but nonetheless, the idea that is a total immersive artificial environment. So on the one hand, it's got trees that have been planted, but it's also self-seeded with other shrubs and herbs and species in there. So it feels like you are immersed in a natural environment, but the natural environment is like half the width of this room or something like that. It's highly compressed, but it's actually adjacent to a really high density housing sort of subdivision. And so then as you kind of move from there, you leave that sort of area, and then you start to emerge into the sort of town itself, and you can see how there's a really careful way of utilising the same material. So trees, we have bike lanes move through here. There's a separation of different types of traffic, of service lanes. So you're also doing as much as you can to maintain sort of spatial differentiation in a place where visually you could look as far as you could look to the horizon. So when you've got something that's that flat, anything you can do with either topography, height, trees to mitigate that depth is about bringing some sort of surprise into that landscape. Then as you move into the town of Heerenveen itself, and for me this was a really nice sort of example. I mean, for me, Netherlands is too cute. I can't stand it. It drives me bananas. Even, as I said, even the coffee shops are cute. It's too much. But and because like what they do is they say all of the bad things have a right to exist, and we'll put them all together in a little street, and we'll call it like Bad Street, and we'll sort of style it so it looks a bit scary. And it's sort of everything has its place. You know that if something bad's going to happen, people will sit down and negotiate about how to make it work for everybody, because I thought that the Netherlands was really kind of liberal, but in actual fact, as I was told, it's not liberal, it's just that everybody has a right to make money. And so if your job is to sell weed, then that's your right to make money, and so we have to work out how to accommodate your right to make money. And so that's the way that they work. And I mean, I also was told about method that they call, another model that they call the Polder model of consultation, which is that because water politics is such a big thing, you can never leave a conversation and say we're not going to have a polder, because the water management is so fundamental that nobody can opt out of that. It's so basic that if you can't say no to it. And so what they have is this model called the Polder model, where everyone sits down and talks to each other with the idea that nobody can leave until there is agreement, which is the other way of saying nobody leaves the table until everybody is equally upset. And if everybody's equally upset, if everyone feels like I've lost some skin in this transaction and you've lost some skin in this transaction, then we're all equally giving something up, then that's okay. So no one's got the upper hand. But anyway, so this model for me is interesting because these particular pavers that they're using here, they have one side of them that's glazed and one side of them that's roughened. And so as a kind of an aesthetic, as a way of operating, as a kind of, what I like about it is that it's like, it's a pattern which is really not a pattern. It's just a flip the paver one way up or flip it the other way up, you know. Obviously it's got a drain, but then they use these kind of, this sort of banding to indicate a kind of adjacency. So when there's a sort of street turning off to the side like this, they will indicate that adjacency just by flipping it to say there's another thing coming through. So it's sort of like the layers of the aesthetic of landscape, and working with less is something that they do really, really well. So we might even finish a bit early today, but I want to talk a little bit. Some of this is going to be quite architectural, but I think it's important to discuss some of this in relationship to this lecture, because the influence of Koolhaas on landscape architecture has been immense, as big as it's been probably on architecture, and it's also changed some of the scope of what landscape architecture regards itself as being. That said, Koolhaas is not a terribly big fan of landscape architecture. He has worked with some famous landscape architects in his career. For example, the Parc La Villette entry of Koolhaas's, Michel and Claire Corrigeau worked on that. The work that he did, a lot of work that he did early on, the French landscape architect Yves Brunière also worked on their projects. Koolhaas's uncle is also a famous Dutch planner, etc. But I think Koolhaas, and also this is a little bit of a side sort of movement here, which is partly also to talk to landscape people who might not know Koolhaas as well as the architects. This project here is this book here is obviously one of Koolhaas's first major pieces of work, undertaken with Madeleine Vriesendorp, who is his wife here, is the artist of this picture. And I think it's important to recognise that Koolhaas was originally a journalist before he studied architecture. And so, in a way, media is a big part of the sort of OMA Koolhaas brand. And Delirious New York is, I think, important because it works with a lot of what Koolhaas works with, which has been around thinking about urbanisation processes and sort of conceptual rationales of buildings and projects that are outside the sphere of architecture, which is why it ends up being so influential in landscape architecture. So, for example, in Delirious New York, Koolhaas has a great chapter on the skyscraper movement and the ways that New York generated the skyscraper, and particularly looking at these drawings of Ferris, who was able to look at the way that sun moved into the ground if buildings went up, because one of the main criteria by which the zoning laws or the height limits of New York were controlled was via shade. And so by undertaking these kind of drawn analyses, they were, Koolhaas, it talks about Ferris's unlocking of the height limit through these kind of studies. Yeah.
Is it significant that the city plan and the central park are the mat in that bedroom?
Yes. Well, I don't know. Read the book. It is actually a fantastic. It is. I don't know if anybody's read this book at all. It's a really. It's like you could read it like a novel. It's like a fantastic book because if you want to understand New York as a city and the urbanization of it and so much kind of trivia about it, like this kind of trivia, like that all of these famous architects, got up into a kind of like a, what do you call those things where, like for a costume ball and dress themselves up as their buildings. Like, it's a really irreverent account of the city. But the reason why this is also interesting is this is an example of what you might call design research. And so design research is a really important term, I think, because there's, I don't know if you guys have heard a little bit, those of the students who are studying with Nick and Kevin have probably had a chat about design research. No, not yet, maybe, could be, whatever. Design research is quite important because if you think about the way that research has been founded around science, then in a way design has been locked out of that research because of the fact that it doesn't have the same rules of causality that science has. Like science has a proof that you can give to somebody else and they could test it and they could come to the same result. But design doesn't operate that way. And so design research is, there's a sort of model, the model that Peter Downton, one of my old teachers, who was a major theorist of design research, and it's a model that largely comes from a university I studied at called RMIT in Australia, because a South African guy called Leon van Schaik actually came over to Australia and started that model in that university and now has exported it all over the world. And some of the theorising from this guy, Peter Downton, is that there's research for design, which is just research that you undertake. Maybe you study the site, you research the site. And that's something you do in the process for you to understand what you're doing. The research is not literally the design. The research is something you're doing to do the design. Then there's research about design, which is one where one might, for example, talk to designers, or famously there was an anthropologist ethnographer who did her PhD on OMA and did an ethnography of OMA in Koolhaas. And so that's research about design. And then there's the model, which is the kind of research by design, which is through the act of designing, we actually come up with something. And this is a really clear example because it's the same thing where you could do all of the guidelines you want to do about how to design a car park in turning circles, but until you've sat there and tried to nut out a car park, you haven't learnt anything about car parking. And so you've researched car parking through designing the car park. The person who hasn't designed the car park, who's just actually read the guidelines, they're not in any stronger position. They're not in a strong position to do it. So through the act of designing, we discover certain things. And this is a good example of that model by testing angles, alignments, projecting shade at different times of the day. Ferris was able to demonstrate that height would not stop ground landscape amenity. And this is a piece of research that I became aware of through Koolhaas. Now, in the sort of periods of postmodernism, Koolhaas also developed a number of urbanistic strategies that are also quite interesting. And so some of those strategies, one of those most famous strategies that that Koolhaas developed with OMA was one for a place called Melun Senar. And this strategy is quite interesting because essentially Koolhaas was, if you go through the years of Koolhaas's writing and Koolhaas's approach to urbanism, while we can talk about urbanistic practice of the sort that we're talking about here, which is kind of best practice Dutch landscape planning, to some extent, and urban planning, or Stadbouw, I think is what they were calling it. At the same time, he crossed a line in the 90s where he decided that the city was no longer able to be planned. And he completely disavowed planning because he said, ultimately, the forces of capitalism are so strong and the market is so strong that effectively cities now cannot be planned anymore. They just happen on their own. And so planning is ineffective. It's also revisionist insofar as it's trying to push the city back into an older model of itself, and that it's no longer relevant. And so he wrote a series of essays, one on bigness, another one called Generic City, and both of those, in a way, tried to look at the role of the project, and also saying these days, the big project, the big building had a massive influence on the city beyond what planning had. If you think about a shopping mall and the influence that that has on a city, a shopping mall effectively can take out an entire place. You put a shopping mall near a not so much, it's going a little way the opposite now, but if you put a shopping mall near a high street, traditionally, generally in the last 20 years, the shopping mall will take down the high street. Are the architects really designing a building when they design a shopping mall? They're designing an exterior and an interior inside a box. It's really being run by property managers, quantity surveyors. And so in a way, his claim around bigness was those are the forces that are building the city. Now, so instead for Mellon Sinar, he proposed, well, we can't really propose how to design the city, but what we can do is we can build in obstructions into the landscape that stop the city at certain places. And so, interestingly, the best example of how to do this is apartheid. It's not really a great precedent, but apartheid utilised land practices to do this. And ironically, before I'd really thought about apartheid, when I was in Australia, and I was like talking to students about how to preserve, green landscapes and stop sprawl, I said, what you need to do is you need to put some toxic land uses on the edges of suburbia, and it'll drive the real estate prices down, and then that will stop the open space getting chewed up by development. And ironically, I moved to South Africa, and I discovered that's exactly what the apartheid regime was doing for a long time. So I'm kind of not in a really good space about that as a strategy, but it's still interesting that this is the strategy that they were pursuing here. So they created a series of, basically they isolated places that had qualities in parks and strips of different things, and they really said, let's lock down the things that have value and let's just give up on the rest. And so it's a kind of interesting approach to take, because it also recognises that the landscape, to some extent, in lots of places has become generic due to development processes. So instead, let's keep what's important. Let's let the market do the rest. Let's let the impediments direct where things are going to happen. So let's not say what should happen here. Let's instead say what's not going to happen here, and let the rest just find its own velocity around that path. And so that was that sort of scheme. Now, obviously, Koolhaas started something called AMO, which is, I never understood what it was, but it's actually, it comes from the idea of OMA was working from west to east, and they wanted to, AMO wanted to work from east to west. And so instead of working from a Eurocentric paradigm, AMO was trying to sort of learn from other places that were experiencing development pressures. And so instead of publishing projects, what Koolhaas started publishing was research, and moved all the projects themselves to the property section of his book, which is kind of a nice touch. So it's saying all we do is really just property. It's not actually really anything special. What's interesting is what's happening in the world. And so one part that's sort of one of those parts, and I think this is where I kind of want you to remember this from the for this project. Koolhaas also did this series of sort of pieces of research, and here's something they did on the Gulf, and they started to mine what's happening in the Gulf and to demonstrate how things were developing around a certain size of these series of these sort of criteria, to understand what was happening in relationship to, for example, the relationship between import and export, understanding the way that how long the things like how long oil would last, what people were doing with oil money before it gave up, and so trying to analyse and understand those other zones. Now, if you could take an approach like this to somewhere in Africa outside South Africa and start to dig into Angola, or dig into other parts of Africa and try to find a kind of design research way of mining those places, that would be really exciting to me. Now, AMO or OMA, I should say, seeded quite a lot of practices. And, for instance, these days, Bjarke Engels is probably one of the best known architects in the world, and he was one of the people in the office of Koolhaas. But probably one of the most famous, one of the early ones to come out was the practice MVRDV. And interestingly, something that people don't realise is that MVRDV were, Winnie Maas was actually a landscape architect. And so Winnie Maas came through the Wageningen School of Landscape Architecture and studied architecture after studying landscape architecture. And so a lot of the urban planning work that they undertake comes from a landscape perspective. Now, if we think about Ferris's approaches here to design research, and we think about Koolhaas's approach to Melançonat as you know, save these bits and give up the rest, and testing, then this project by MVRDV is a sort of classic about how do you keep density in a certain amount of space and keep like if you can't go up and if you have to have a certain amount of car parking and you want to actually be able to maintain a certain amount of dwelling units, then this is the sort of strategy that you might start to work on, which is in a way turning a constraint into something that's formally productive. I used to have a teacher who used to say an interesting project is where you have to put in a swimming pool that is the same size as the site, but you have to have 100% site coverage. And so suddenly you have a swimming pool house because you've got a constraint. And so this is where, when teachers talk about constraints enabling a project, it's about that sort of approach, and I think that's an example of it. Another one that's an example of it is this project of MVRDV's, I think it's called the Silo House, is basically, this is essentially a diagram of program in this building, and then it's been sort of squashed into a kind of spreadsheet and sort of keyed in a certain sort of way, and then the building becomes an example of the diagram, color-coded, etc. And so, in a way, the building is a piece of information. And so, this idea of essentially what you're seeing is that these projects stop being about architecture as such, and in a way start being about something else. Now, I'm in two minds about this to some extent. When I grew up in Melbourne and studied in Melbourne, that we were very much favouring this kind of model of design. But then I moved to a place called Brisbane, which was full of people making beautiful things out of timber. And I decided, maybe architecture and making things nice is kind of interesting. So, so some people would say this has got nothing to do with architecture. Another project of MVRDV's, which is a nice one, which is a kind of, in a way, maybe not next week, but the week after we might talk about, depends when I can get to Josie, but interpretation machines. But this is a classic example of an interpretation machine. This is from the Hanover Expo, and the Dutch Pavilion. And as you can see here, in a way, it's showing a demonstration of where the landscape exists actually at this higher level, whereas in actual fact, or the displacement of the ground. And so here it's saying in the lower levels that effectively they're underground, and then it's putting the landscape in the middle of the structure. And this nice thing about how it's using these it's got these trees in amongst the structure. So this is obviously in the middle of this building. And I think it's if we think about this idea of the Dutch making land, I think it's an interesting example of that put into a building. Now, in terms of contemporary landscape architecture, probably the practice that has been the most important from the perspective of the export of Dutch landscape architecture internationally, particularly in the 90s into the thousands, and there's still a major practice, is West 8. And this guy called Adriaan Geuze. And I suppose I gave you some readings from West 8 on the Vula site, and those are from a period where actually West 8 hadn't yet built that much, and they were in this sort of speculative zone. And if we think about the fact that Koolhaas's, like Zaha Hadid and Bernard Tschumi and a whole generation of architects who came through the Architectural Association or were patrons or had Alvin Boyarsky from the Architecture Association who supported their careers, a lot of them didn't build until they were in their 30s and 40s. And so this idea of paper architecture and the idea of testing through, in lieu of a project, testing through competitions was really important. And so similarly, that model was not present in landscape architecture until Koolhaas. And so now, for example, if you go to somewhere like or if you look at the practices and practitioners associated with, say, the University of Pennsylvania, where McHarg was and Corner was, etc., or if you look at Harvard with Waldheim, etc., most of the landscape architects who are working there are working from this paradigm of competition practice, unbuilt practice. And so West 8 worked from that mode as well, and I think they were the first to do it in landscape. And so they also embraced this sort of artificiality thing, and this project here, called Sjobergplein, is actually a really important project for that. And so it's a totally denatured landscape. It's in Rotterdam, and Rotterdam is sort of regarded as the sort of for Koolhaas and a lot of the people coming out of OMA. It's a sort of perfect Dutch city because it's it's in a way the opposite to what's known as the donut city, which is a lot of the time the donut city is that in the centre of the city it's really dead because it's an old city, like Europe is like a lot of European cities, the centre like Amsterdam is dead. You can't do anything in it, it's only tourism. And so what happens is in the next band out, in Rotterdam, because of the fact that the centre of Rotterdam was bombed by the English, in actual fact, I think it was by the English when the Dutch were being occupied. I might be wrong. Someone to do some research for me, but nonetheless, the centre was bombed out. And so the old part of Rotterdam is on the outside, and the new part of Rotterdam is in the centre. Interestingly, although I didn't know about South Africa, I went to that old part and I found this cute little sort of canal type of thing in a place called Delfshaven. And what's interesting is that's where the Dutch East India Company launched from. And I remember thinking to myself, this is such a cute little place for such a horrifying international impact in terms of, this cute little spot where you couldn't have even fitted it looks like you couldn't even fit a ship that's as wide as this room up this cute little canal, was where half the world was like turned upside down. And so I found that an interesting place. But in the centre, therefore, the centre is very urban. And so this project essentially has no ground. And so like I showed you in the Barcelona week where I talked about the Països de Catalans, the station, the Sant station, this ground plane is all about artificiality. And so this diagram by West 8 here shows how the city itself is made up of a whole lot of roofs in amongst the city landscape, and their site is just another roof in amongst a sort of series of different planes that make up the city. And so, for example, you can see here some sort of light coming through, particularly at night. And so what's the surface of Sjobergplein is made up of transparent materials of different sorts. Timber with gaps in between it, metal, perforated metals, a whole range of transparent materials. And as you see these patterns through it are when cars are coming through underneath and different parts of the car park would light up. And so the light comes through onto the surface through all of these different materials. And so the surface is a sort of highly differentiated light surface. And at the same time, they also had, they had a sort of diagram of the sort of graphic of the Rhine coming into Rotterdam. And then they had these lights where the lights, let me find a better picture of the lights, where the lights were able to be moved with a grill, that was pre-EU, dropped into it, and then a kind of joystick to allow you to move the light around, etc. And naturally those worked for about a day, and then after that they all stopped working. At the same time, we can see other sort of tropes of the period, and so, obviously little things like by elevating this a tiny bit like this, you step onto it, so you realise that it's actually a kind of false surface. It's not the ground, it's making you aware. There's a gap all the way around of a grill so you can see that it's artificial. And then also here you can see these seats are all about multifunctionality, and so this is a period where the idea of program was really big. And so with that in mind, the idea of shifting program, ambiguous program, the idea that people could appropriate this seat in any way. It could be something you lean on, sit on, stand on, whatever. And so that was a really popular way of operating in that period. And so these are some of the things that West 8 were sort of really involved with. Another project of theirs that's very famous, and a really interesting example, is called Borneo Sporenburg, which is in Amsterdam. It's one of the islands off the edge of. It's one of the islands that are sort of on the edge of the city, and there's a whole lot of these islands that are named after different sort of colonial places. And as a piece of design, it's quite interesting because it's sort of quite a classical piece of urban design in a sense. And so, if you think about the model that we were, talking about earlier, where you infill, you determine what's important, and you let the rest go. In this project, West 8 proposed a series of major sort of buildings that were kind of like sort of hooks into the rest of the development. So this building here, there's a sight line out to other landmarks from these buildings, and the buildings, you could see each other from the buildings, and so they became devices to link together each of these three separate spaces through here. And then after that, what they did is they set up a series of rules for these spaces in between, and then they gave them out to different practices. And so this is something I call a Project Zoo, which I think I've talked to you guys about already, where after modernism, when everyone was really felt that the master plan as a rigid thing should be resisted, but you still want a level of order, how do you deal with those two? Well, you create a master plan that is a series of rules, and then after that you allow individuals to work with those rules. And this is a kind of more contemporary version of how we work with a master plan. And so after that, they then set up, I wonder if I've got these diagrams where they said there has to be a certain ratio of open space. And so, for example, what they're trying to say is they set up this percentile system, and then and they set up a height limit, and a sort of a idea that there must be in a way, the buildings must be zero setback on either side. And so internally, all of the architects worked on different ways of dealing with that open space inside the building situation. And again, if you look at this list, so many of these are ex-OMA people. It's quite interesting. Neutlings, De Geita, etc. A lot of them different. Van Berkel, I think it was. And so anyway, this also meant that in these situations there became a whole lot of sort of different ways of dealing with. Trellis doors, they have them there too. And so of the interior-exterior relationships. Now, interestingly, public space is a sort of a strange thing. And so I visited this place, and we turned up with a whole lot of students in a bus. And when you've got not really much, in a way, there's a kind of acceptance that public space is something that's utilised very heavily. And so we turned up in a bus, and it was interesting to find, here we had 30 students, and here's this guy with his power tool making his table, and there's his wife doing her washing out on the street. And it was just like, what is wrong with this? It's weird. It's really weird. So I got 30 students dropped off anyway. And so also as part of that, if you think back to this, idea of the multifunctional seat. Similarly, here is another example from that period, and this is one of these bridges at Borneo Sporenburg. And by the way, you can see here how the differentiation occurs within that framework. Now, how different is this from Val de Vie? Is an interesting question. And so some of those big buildings, I don't know if I've got examples of what those big buildings look like. But one thing, this bridge is quite amazing. And so on the one hand, it's a bridge, but along the bridge that links these to the sides, it actually transforms into a whole lot of different things. So it starts off by being a kind of like a set of steps. As you move into the bridge sort of opens out to, it's almost like it becomes a kind of space that you're inside, because it then climbs up into a ramp on the other side and then sort of comes down, etc. And so it's a sort of example of this sort of multifunctionality we're talking about. Now, finally, a practice that probably one of the most emergent practices in the Netherlands is a guy called, or two people, Sylvia Carras, who was here a couple of years ago, and a guy called Bart Brands, and they were part of a practice called Bureau B&B. And so, if we think, I talked to you before about the sort of compositionality of this sort of work in the 90s and the kind of collage approach. And so this is a sort of park called Cromhelm Park with this sort of series of structures. Now, you go back to the Barcelona examples, sort of architecturalization of everything, a sort of, you don't simply just have a sort of walkway, everything becomes a kind of piece of architecture. There's a sort of period where suddenly in landscape everyone's interested in architectural detail. You start to find, which is happening now, where landscape architects are hiring architects to work for them to do detailing. We find other tropes that are happening in this project, so that we have, for example, the kidney-shaped sort of pool. And so you can very much see this as a kind of like a composition. And one of the more recent projects that was undertaken there, which has been very celebrated and has won a few of the bigger awards, the international landscape awards, is this cemetery in Amsterdam. And so this, what the sort of almost like this is the kind of this is a scheme for a new part of the cemetery that is up there. And so previously, Ballot and Sylvia analysed this cemetery, and they looked at this the way it was organised, and they found it was organised around sort of faith lines and around particular familial relationships. And so they proposed that a contemporary cemetery in a country that was more and more atheist was less about that, and it was our identity was much more fluid. And so what do you get? You get the rainbow. And so from this, and also the barcode, and from that they generated this landscape that was a series of these kind of strips that had different sorts of offerings in terms of crypts, columbariums, etc. And so you can see here again this sort of graphic approach from that's still present in that generation. Now there's another side of work which I haven't shown so much in here, which is going more in the way of the earlier Dutch work, which is around landform building. And so what's unfortunately happened again in the Netherlands is that there's again become this separation off, despite the fact in the 20th century where this work was happening, the separation of ecology and landscape architecture there was no separation. They were integral to the kind of land building project. Now ecologically based landscape practices are separating out, and the landscape practices that are, inverted commas, interested in design are more following this kind of this sort of Koolhaasian sort of model. And so yeah, that's the lecture. And I suppose the reason, just to reiterate before we finish, why this is important is that as we move through, more and more of the lectures we're going to look at will be utilising landscape and ecological systems to create design. And I think that the way that came into international landscape architecture in the last 20 years, despite there being precedents in, for instance, the work of Olmsted, has been through the Dutch. And so I think that they're a logical starting point into that approach. That's it. 15 minutes early. What's wrong? What did I do wrong?